Isabella, Jeff, if you don't mind, if I could transition, I can't think of a segue. If I was a professional, I could think of one. You mentioned the word market, Isabella. So speaking of market, I would say that we have been on a glide path since 2008 in a particular direction. More central bank unorthodox policies and continuously weak economy. But the politicians have stayed out of it. Last year, we had a serious shock, a really unusual one with the corona. And I don't know if people, I would guess that they believe we're just going to go back to the way things were. We're just going to continue on with just central banking and politicians are off to the side. I think that may be changing. I think we may look back and see that this was the beginning of the end of as we enter a new order. And I think the politicians are going to become much more involved in deciding economic outcomes, economic policy, monetary policy even, and sidelines of central banks, because I don't think they've done a very good job, the central banks. And I think the politicians who have to face the voters every so often are feeling the heat. So what do you think about our future? Is it going to be more of the same, or are we going to start seeing things like universal basic income and modern monetary theory, that sort of big change?
Well, I mean, I'm not as expert in what's going on in the US now as say here in the UK, but I think UBI is clearly on the table, and I think furlough has normalized this, because furlough is effectively a trial in UBI. And
can you tell our audience, Isabella, because that's one of those words that never made it across the Atlantic. What is furlough? What is actually happening in Britain now?
Do you know what? Nobody knew this word until last year, and then somebody like found it in a box left over from like the dark ages or whatever. And it's basically when you pay someone not to work because of whatever reason, but you still want them contracted, and you are basically paying them not to work. So I think you guys had something similar. You didn't. You had stimulus checks. That's what you never had the furlough, of course. Being really dumb. I should have known that. Please cut that. But yes, of course, because so we had furlough, and we also have the NHS, which makes a very big difference. And we had the Thursday clap for the NHS. I don't know if you heard about that. Yeah.
Well, is that the story with Greensill?
No.
Celebrating the National Health Service, and
it was very Maoist. It was very Maoist. It was like everyone would come out with their pots and pans on a Thursday, and we would do a celebratory clap for the good that the NHS was doing. And Boris Johnson would be leading the clap, and so would high-profile celebrities. And if you were not seen clapping, that was a red mark against you, because you were obviously not one. I
didn't know that. I hope that gets cut out too.
Well, luckily,
embarrassing.
It did. Thank God. Because that was, as a Polish person, it wasn't not my thing. But anyway.
Well, no, it was very Mao. That's what the Maoist Chinese did. The Cultural Revolution is you have to signal your loyalty to whatever the government effort of the day is, and of course, under Maoist terms, it could change by a daily basis, which is sort of the point. How do we weed out people who are objecting, right?
But that was the absurd thing. Like in COVID time, everything is a contradiction, and everyone is exactly like that. We still have to clap no matter what. Like U-turn after U-turn, we still have to clap. As if,
one day you're clapping that masks are no good, the next day you're clapping that masks are good, and then it can change on a daily basis. And really, the point is to get you to accept no matter what the government says.
And I, as a Polish, I've never had to reference my Polish roots as much as I did in the last year, and people think I've gone crazy. But I think my team thinks I've gone crazy. But like, I am a Pole, and I have like living memory of this, and as a result, I am unnerved by it. Maybe I am being over the top, and maybe that's why my friends think I've gone down some weird radical path. But I haven't. I'm not radical. I'm a very moderate person, but it is like visceral for me. I can't subscribe to that sort of stuff.
My mother does.
Hey, Emil and I have talked about this a lot, and I've written about this for years too, is this creeping socialism that is a byproduct of the lack of answers in this post-2008 environment. I mean, most people don't understand communism and socialism to begin with. They don't really know what it is. It sounds great. Collectivism always sounds terrific from the outside because it's unity, solidarity, all of these types of things that sound really terrific, and you don't really understand what it is. And you're thinking, you know, Jay Powell says the economy is booming right now. I don't see it. So maybe the socialism stuff is, maybe it can't be that bad. And so I think, you know, what's happened is because there has been a lack of answers for so long, people are searching for alternatives, and socialism is a very well-established alternative that is very sellable. It's very easy for somebody to say capitalism is to blame for all your problems. Freedom isn't really freedom. You're actually a slave. All of the stuff that Karl Marx talked about many years ago, that stuff has become true. Capitalism, inequality, blah, blah, blah. Next thing you know, people who might not normally be sympathetic to clapping for the NHS are suddenly doing so enthusiastically because, you know, what else are they going to do?
Absolutely. And, you know, we on Alphaville have had a series for a long time called the Entire Economy is Fire Festival. And the point of that series really is that, you know, what we have at the moment is sort of just I wouldn't call it capitalism in the conventional sense. It's a sort of weird corporate capitalism which has become infiltrated by all sorts of corrupt influences. And it's also you know, the fake it till you make it thing, and all of that stuff collectively has created a failing in capitalism. But when people want to displace it with an alternative, it's still the best system that we have, and capitalism, but it has to be, in my opinion, we need to rediscover, like, we have to shed the crappy bits we've applied to it. We've got to get away from corporate capitalism, because actually if you read Lenin knows that eventually, like, his whole prediction is that capitalism eats itself because it will create a massive monopoly and become like, you know, a authoritarian state, you know, system. It's just, you know, that is where Amazon is going, right? So we don't have any votes in how Amazon operate. I mean, unless you're a shareholder, right? So, and even then.
Well, it's like Schumpeter. Schumpeter said that, look, opposite Lenin, capitalism should never stand still. Creative destruction. We should never end up with as Emil calls it, a cul-de-sac, where we do have that monopoly situation. I think what needs to be rediscovered is the capital part of capitalism. We've lost that. You know, wealth isn't money. It isn't numbers on your bank statement. Wealth is productive processes that are efficient. You know, it's real businesses. That's what capital is supposed to be. And we've gone to this financialist or financialism model that is sort of capitalism resembling, and it kind of looks that way, but it's really not. And I absolutely agree with that.
And a good segue between the former conversation and this one is that obviously one of the problems with journalism, in my opinion, is the whole if it's free, you're the product model of Silicon Valley, because that has mispriced journalism. It has, you know, that's one of the reasons why journalism is losing sight of itself. But if you're free, you're the product system is a real thing. And in the capitalistic concept, in version of that, I think what we're having is this UBI situation, because UBI, furlough, whatever, great, it sounds fantastic. And I used to think that UBI was a good idea. I genuinely did. And I have no, you know, when I was pushing back against all the other stuff, I thought UBI was the answer, especially because I thought there was a liquidity issue that needed to be, you know, the genie had to be released. But in the current context, I just worry, because we know so much more about two-sided markets and about how if it's free, okay, so you get your money from the state, but how can you ever protest the state if you're so dependent on it for your UBI check? And yes, it's universal, and you can put it into some sort of legal, you know, codex so that no one can ever be discriminated against it. But then they also said that about all sorts of other things. And now what we're learning from COVID, I think, is that discrimination doesn't have to happen like on a government level to really be discriminatory, because the corporates end up like enforcing these policies, and it's the you know, so I'm not cool with that, because I think, generally speaking, okay, if it's universal, there is a sort of equilibrium level to it, so perhaps it all evens itself out. But in the MMT example, and I'd be interested to hear what you think, is you know, the idea is that we can balance this off with tax, right? So you'll never get inflationary because we'll just tax everybody, right? But what are they going to do? And maybe I need to ask Rohan more, Rohan Gray, who's my main information provider on MMT. So you tax more, but if you're taxing, you're still going to spend that tax. It's not like unless you actually expire the money from the system by doing the opposite of QE, that system, the money still stays in the system. Just because you're taxed, it just gets transferred to like spending in the public sector, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, I think what MMT proponents would say is that taxation isn't really their inflationary lever. What they would say is the jobs bank is the inflation lever. What they do is they would absorb jobs into the public program, which I think looks a lot like your furlough program, I believe. So, you know, essentially they're using the labor market as their inflation moderator. We'll release labor back into the private labor force. We'll take it out of the private labor force by increasing or lowering the wage rate as needed. And yet it's all the same thing, because then you still have a bunch of economists sitting in a room trying to determine what they believe is the optimal wage rate that will allow them to control inflation and all these other economic variables. And money's a part of it too, the central bank printing money or doing quantitative easing or its equivalent. But by and large, it's all of these things put together where it's the same problem, where you have a small group of people operating on imperfect information, believing that they don't have imperfect information, and they can guide in a completely complex economic system through large margins of error, which is essentially what the job bank is. It's absorbing a lot of error.
And it's presumably like, you know, how do you tweak that lever justifiably? Because at the moment, obviously, you can make, you know, some sort of, you know, COVID gives you a justification to say essential versus non-essential, right?
Exactly.
But
it's still an arbitrary. That's, I think, what it comes down to, in my view, is it all breaks down because it's all arbitrary. Now, the MMTers say, no, this is all well thought out. We've got mathematical algorithms. We've got complex models that tell us this is what we do when we do. And it's still the same junk that central bankers use now that had led them into negative interest rates and quantitative easing. It's just really the idea that you can control a complex system through very simple means. And I
like this idea of people being used as a lever in this way, because these are real jobs, real people. Like some, you know, if you invest, one day you're on the private payroll, the next day the government's paying you to do God knows what. I mean, they're giving you a job doing what? I mean, you know, shoveling leaves out in the park or so. I mean, who knows what it is? You're right. How are you going to live as a person? Furlough, you do whatever you want. You just got a job to just live and consume. Your job is to consume. That is basically your job.
That's, you know, if that's the extent of the MMT jobs program, it'll fail very quickly, because that doesn't create wealth. I mean, that's always been the argument against the Keynesian view of building pyramids in the desert. Yeah, you can build pyramids in the desert on the government's dime, but that doesn't do anything for an economy in the long run. And if MMT is going to rely on that type of wasteful, arbitrary jobs decision, it won't create any kind of wealth that will allow them to marginalize or demarginalize an economy that's struggling, because what an economy struggling needs is real capital.
So I think one of the things they propose is, and I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this too, is it's not just that people can be sitting on furlough. They're going to put this idle labor to work, like reframing the entire sort of capitalist system to be green, right? So there's going to be green jobs, green, and ESG and all this stuff. And so I generally think that the ESG model has not been properly scrutinized. I don't think social entrepreneurship as a concept has been properly scrutinized. And I think there's a sort of reluctance to take a critical eye to it, because it is wrapped in this, you know, force shield of good deeds, right? It's all supposed to be about, you know, moral, ethical investing. And so how can you possibly do a critique of it? You'd be a horrible meanie to do it. So, and yet the road to hell is often paved with good intentions. So I'm very suspicious that there aren't like going to be massive externalities from that. And I think today, I mean, it's questionable whether this was the only reason, but AstraZeneca, obviously, all the vaccine makers are doing it at cost. And we've had AstraZeneca be denied, you know, they've been cancelled in Europe because of like probably Brexit war, but in reality, you know, they're claiming it's unsafe. And AstraZeneca price goes up. And my initial reaction was, well, is it going up because the markets like that it's not producing something at cost?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's always the argument, the road to communism is always paved with good intentions. And I think the problem is, especially, you know, Lenin figured this out and Deng Xiaoping certainly understood this in China, was spontaneous organization. The idea that we can have people gather together in spontaneous ways in order to efficiently handle problems, which is something that you cannot organize from a top-down approach. So if we're talking about, you know, going back to MMT and the jobs bank and things like that, you want to put together this, you know, you have this giant pool of labor that you can use however you want, and you want to transition, you know, you want to use them for a green project, for example. Well, you're not allowing spontaneous organization by skill. You want to build a green power plant, you need specific skills in order to do that. And you need specific skills being available at specific times. And you can't just simply plan from the top and say, okay, we're going to have the engineers do this, then this, you know, then we need specialized labor that knows how to do whatever it is building a power plant. You know, it's the very same thing that Mao ran into in his Great Leap Forward when he had everybody, you know, turning their backyards into pig iron smelting facilities. You have to allow for spontaneous organization. As we said before, if you've got people working as one job in the private sector one day, and then the very next day they're supposed to be working on a green project that they have no skills they're adaptable for, without any kind of transition period, it's spontaneous organization, I think, is one of the secrets to capitalism. As long as we have capital.
I absolutely agree. And I think, again, we've discussed it when we're talking about the media, is that that's why you can't be a jack of all trades, because the experts won't want to read you. So you have to acknowledge there's an expert market and a jack of all trade market. And the two are completely different. And, you know, the gig economy and all that, that's servicing those like very low skill transferable jobs. But you can't.
Yeah, the labor force is not homogeneous. It's not like you're just looking at a unit of work. Right. Yeah. And I think you know, especially you look at some of these DSGE models that even MMT is nothing more than neo-Keynesianism without restraint. And they really look at these things very simplistically. Like we just have a unit of work. We need a certain number of workers and this stuff will happen. And it's overly simplistic because, again, it doesn't pay any attention to the fact that, you know, labor force, even any big project, is not homogeneous. You know, you have to have specific arrangements and specific skills. And that's really what the market is good for. It's assigning values and so that we can have a certain number of available when it needs to be available. And, you know, spontaneous organization is the key to efficiency. And there's no way to achieve that in a top-down approach.
But I'm sure someone will say we've got machine learning or something to do it for us. Like, so because it all goes down this like Gosplan road, doesn't it? Where you have this like grand vision that you don't even need currency as a settlement tool, because you don't need that like middleman float of the currency to incentivize the work or the demand to balance, right? So you don't need that balancing agent, right? And Gosplan was this, you know, it just didn't ever work because you do. In the end, I think the Soviet system had it was known as oh gosh, I've forgotten it now.
No, everything can't be just in time. There has to be some margin of error because we live in an unpredictable world. And you're right. I think there is a lot of people, especially economists in particular, who believe that through power of computing, through advances in mathematics, that we can plan to the nth degree so that everything just fits perfectly in a predictable fashion. And that's just, you know, if you know anything about Benoit Mandelbrot or chaos theory or, you know, fractals and things like that, you know, that's just, it's a ridiculous assumption to believe that you can mathematically plan out optimal outcomes for even a slightly complex system, let alone an incredibly complex system like the global economy. It's just, it's not doable.
The system I was thinking of was Comic-Con, and I just wanted to say, and that was the sort of loose sort of tie-up of all the different communist countries in their economic system. But they couldn't survive. They had to have external and internal, they had to have an import-export market beyond their system.
It was the only way to get hard currency.
It wasn't, it couldn't work as a closed system.
Yeah.
Izabella, can I follow up on your last point regarding Ghost Plan? Because I think some of our audience members may be listening, and some of them may agree with UBI or ESG or MMT, and others may not. But I think in a fair number of cases, people are assuming that that political belief will be left to the realm of politics and it'll be kept out of finance and investments. But I don't believe that'll be the case. And I was wondering what you think. To me, the free market, the movement of capital, the ability to invest in this company or that company is going to be severely constrained, that it's incompatible with the movement towards MMT, UBI, Ghost Plan, and it's going to be government saying, these are productive investments, these are unproductive investments, and those will have taxes on them and all manner of capital controls or whatnot. And what do you think of that idea? Is that this is not just a political discussion, it will come into markets?
Of course it will come into markets, because markets were fundamentally what broke the USSR. Like, you know, you can try and top down, like you can try and create a regime that tells you what you want to consume, right? And that's what Ghost Plan basically does. To balance the books, if there's too many bananas, you have to create a narrative as to why this week banana bread is a fantastic thing for everyone to make, because then that clears the surplus, right? And you nothing goes to waste. And likewise, if there's suddenly a deficit of apples, then it's important to put out the propaganda that, you know, it's been noted that there is some sort of terrible poison going through the apple community. I don't know. Some sort of fake news. This is how you regulate it. Or you do it with the prices, basically. So bananas get cheap and apples get expensive. Ghost Plan doesn't allow for prices, so you have to use the propaganda, right? So that is essentially my point. So you're just replacing pricing as the signaling with some other like signal, which just turns into, like, in a while everybody will know and interpret that when there's bad news about bananas, well, that just means, you know, the equivalent of what the price would say, right? People aren't stupid. And in communist Poland, you know, it became transparently obvious what was happening. And this is why black markets emerged. And this is how, you know, a market for, you know, Levi jeans or Coca-Cola, all the stuff that you couldn't really easily get. Anyone who had the access and capacity to bring those like supply chains into the Soviet Union was like chief rentier, and they were often people in government positions, and they would, like, you know, you created a two-tier market that was even worse than the one before. Like, so the markets always penetrate because people are resistant to brainwashing. I don't believe people are drones who can just be entirely, you know, controlled by Putin, you know, or whatever. People have their own free will, and if they don't want bananas, they won't want them. And you can try and force bananas on them, but they just won't take them. And the market will always signal that. That is my point. And when you have a massive imbalance like that between people's wants and their and the capacity to service those wants, if you can't make people happy, they will want to leave your system. And then you get sort of people trying to leave, you know, through the Berlin Wall or whatever, and the system cracks down on you, because that is a signal to the rest of the world that your system isn't that great. So either way, the market always comes in. Okay, so maybe algorithms, maybe AI is better at anticipating your wants and doing perhaps, I am sympathetic to the idea that maybe people share enough information through algorithms, then the system will be able to adapt to real wants and desires fairly and squarely. But not in a world where we're also simultaneously pushing a climate agenda, because quite frankly, those two things do not correlate at all, because I can guarantee you, no matter how green and virtuous you are, most of your wants and desires are not going to be serviceable under a green agenda that is wanting to reduce carbon emissions. So you will be pissed off, and then the market will have to signal that in some way. No? Or am I just being stupid?
Well, I agree, but that's why markets will not be allowed to continue. The prices they emit will be not appreciated by government. That was the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, price, what is price? Like price
is information. Price is everything. Price is the most. Yeah,
but what I'm saying is when you suppress prices, or go back to Diocletian, and he did a price edict, right? It was ridiculous, didn't work. All you do is you create a market for new prices. Different signals are interpreted. Oh, that must be, that.
Right.
It's just a euphemism for a price. Okay, so you don't use conventional numbers, but people aren't stupid. That's my point. They will create their own parallel pricing.
Right. That's what always happens in the top-down restrictive regime, is that you end up with, as you said, a black market approach, which is, okay, the official sector says this about bananas, but we don't believe it because we know it's not true. And that's really what prices is supposed to do. It's supposed to cut through all that arbitrary bull and say, this is what is actually happening. And I don't believe you can come up with an algorithm or a mathematical equation that can properly match supply with demand, taste, or demographics, or whatever the fundamental factors are, is because we don't know what tomorrow will look like. Exactly. And all statistical mathematics is based on the stupid assumption that tomorrow will look like today or look like the past. And you can't math beyond that.
You need to watch Adam Curtis, because that's his whole critique. His whole critique is that, have you seen it?
No, I haven't.
Got to watch it. So his whole critique is based on the fact that Google operates exactly like that. If you like this, you will like that. And it assumes that how you were before is going to be how you are tomorrow. That
you're a homogeneous unit that never evolves. When the human species is constantly changing, constantly evolving, and there is no machine learning that can predict taste or anything tomorrow, let alone next year or the year after. So as you said, in the top-down regime, what will end up happening is, because we can't predict, the government will have to come in and say, oh, well, you can't do these things because we didn't predict that you would like to do those things.
And what's interesting is that he also says, the way Google does that, he sees it, and people who work in AI have critiqued this, but I like it. It's simplistic, but I like it. He claims that that's very much how conspiracy theories work. So Google just spots patterns. If you like this, you will like that. And then that's how conspiracy theories work as well. Well, if this happened over here, then that happened over there, then that must mean the two things are connected, and blah, blah, blah. And so he creates this sort of, analogy that Google is kind of like creating this false reality through that, just the way that QAnon does, and whoever does, we all, because there's Blue Anon and there's QAnon, and now I like to call EU Anon because
why not, right?
Everyone's got an Anon. Everyone's going what is wrong about the QAnon narrative is that people think it's singular to just that tribe. It is, everyone is doing their own QAnon. Everyone is their own, it's happening on multiple levels. But the point being with Adam Curtis is that it's this sort of what the current system doesn't let you do is that there is no algorithm monitoring. If you hate this, you will loathe that. It's always on the positive side, right? That's my addition to the table, because the market is asymmetric because it's only focused on what you will like, not on what you will dislike. Do you know what I mean? Amazon isn't tracking what you hate in the same way because it doesn't know what you hate.
And I think, it's because it's still in the infancy stages. I mean, we talk about AI as if it's some kind of developed technology. It's really not. It's really not sophisticated enough. I mean, really what Google is Google's a mirror. It holds up the mirror to society. This is what society looks like, and this is what we believe society is talking about or thinking, or this is their positive preferences. And when you're holding up a mirror to humans, we kind of project anything onto it because we're looking back at ourselves and we know that we're complex organisms and complex societies and complex systems. So it's not that Google is solving problems that we don't know we need to have solved. They're really just taking information and trying to package it in a certain way that they think will be palatable, when in fact they don't really know. They're really they're really kind of alpha testing their own stuff.
And that mirror point is so important, because I look at the world now and I just see mirrors everywhere. Everyone is a mirror of each other, and they don't see that they're a mirror. Like, you have Russiagate, which is the mirror of QAnon. I mean, they'll say it's not. Just hear me out. Like, fair enough, they'll say it's not as egregious because we don't storm the Capitol. But, conceptually, if you are going to be completely neutral about it, you had QAnon trying to do a sort of real life potential coup with the storming of the Capitol, but they would say that the blue anons were trying to do a coup with the Russiagate continuous sort of attacks on Trump. You both are like alleged to be coups, right? Nobody is taking the election results seriously. They're a mirror. They're a mirror of each other. And then you have the mirror between Putin and what's happening in Russia versus what's happening in America, which I also find fascinating. So, for years we tell everybody that Putin is a unelected. Well, he's rigged the elections. He has no, claim to power, and anyone who's challenging him and doing insurrections against Putin, that's fair. And Putin goes, no, my elections were totally fair. You can trust my elections. And rejects the call for independent monitors. And then you have the exact same thing happening on the American side, and it's a funny joke for people in countries that have because it's a mirror of everything that they've been told about their own system for so long.
Yeah, and in a way, it's harmful, because you're saying, well, now Google tells me that everybody else thinks like I do, which means that what I'm thinking must be right. And again, getting back to the breakdown in journalism and the lack of curation of good data, that's really what this mirror is. It allows us to believe that what we think is what everybody else thinks. And it's also, fracturing, breaking down.
Between, like, if I believe my cause is virtuous, then I will find the reasons to justify that cause. And I will find my enemy, everything that I project on my enemy, the enemy is also projecting on me, because
right.
Once society gets polarized to such a degree, the only thing that differentiates you is whether you think your underlying cause is virtuous. But the enemy is just a mirror of you. It's basically that, because it's human nature to create those processes.
And that's, again, the breakdown of evidence, the ability to evaluate evidence objectively and, in a correct manner, which will allow people to say, oh, wait a minute, maybe I'm making the wrong choices. And I think that's one of the downside or the dark side of the breakdown, the introduction of internet technology and the free flow of information, is that it has held up a mirror to humans. And as humans often do, we project some of our worst traits into everything and everybody else, rather than, yes, there are some positive aspects to it, obviously, but it's really the dark side tends to come out. And then these things are amplified by the age in which we live in, this post-crisis era of, tremendous strain. I think people really don't understand what the amount of pressure and strain that is created by the lack of economic growth. It's not so much that the economy is contracting, it's just not growing in the way that it used to. Again, we live in a nonlinear world, and if we're not growing at the same rate, that creates a tremendous amount of strain and pressure that goes just completely unappreciated. And it amplifies all of these negative trends that are now front and center everywhere.
Izabella, we have been talking for a little bit over an hour now, which is great. I want to keep going, but to be mindful of everyone's time, has there been anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to talk about?
Before we finish, Emil, I want to interrupt, and I want to give people a sense of what Izabella does at Financial Times